Welcome to part 3 of my series about the modular soft synth SoloRack. In this third tutorial I talk about the oscillator modules of SoloRack and add some information I left out in tutorial number 2. And because not all of you may have watched the first 2 tutorials in this series, I, like always at the beginning, repeat, those of you who are new to the matter of modular synthesis and maybe not only the absolute beginners, will get all explanations they need to understand what's going on in this video and in all of the following ones, so that everybody can follow and enjoy this series. So, if you watch all parts of this series, you'll build up a comprehensive knowledge base, especially about modular synthesis, but also about synthesis in general. I'll share a remarkable part of my over 40 years of working with synthesizers with you in this series. Be patient and stay curious. Alright, let's add an oscillator to the rack now. Let me start with the SA310 VCO, because this oscillator is the most common one. It delivers all 4 basic waveforms: saw, triangle, square and analog sine. I say analog sine because, like with real hardware analog synths, the sine wave is not a pure one with only one frequency in its spectrum. The frequency spectrum of the oscillator covers more than 12 octaves. With a small switch at the top of the front panel, I choose the basic tuning. I said more than 12 octaves because I can go even beyond that border using control voltage modulating the frequency. Is it necessary to say that the oscillator follows the 1 volt per octave characteristic, meaning that increasing or decreasing the control voltage by 1 volt means increasing or decreasing the output frequency by 1 octave? Well, to be precise, the oscillator works internally at 0.1 volt per octave scheme, but for interconnectivity with other modules, for example hardware SoloRack systems, the result stays the same. The S310 VCO is compatible with them, and with my DAW and with other soft synths and. A matter which I'm going to talk about in a later video when I deal with the modules in the from or to DAW group. Well, talking about control voltage and trigger impulses and so on, I should have a look at these 2 input jacks called trigger and CV now. I use the square wave of an LFO unit and feed it in the trigger in jack. We see and hear that the basic tuning, the octave, jumps up and down with the up and down flanks of the square wave. The upper signal analyzer shows the signals, green the sine wave output of the oscillator, and, what's more important for us right now, blue the up and down flanks, the high and low levels of the square wave. The lower signal analyzer shows the octave jumps. It's important to understand that it is not the level of the square wave which determines the octave, but the direction of the change of the level. The up and the down flanks of the square wave make the S310 VCO change its basic octave. I use the saw wave of the LFO and get a simple rhythm. I insert a second LFO running at a different frequency. The S310 VCO gets the trigger signals at different times now, and always when it gets an up flank it jumps 1 octave up, and always when it gets a down flank it jumps 1 octave down. It doesn't matter from what LFO the flanks the impulses arrive and at what octave the S310 VCO is actually sending its output. Two down flanks, one after the other, make the VCO jump down by 2 octaves. Two up flanks, one after the other, make it jump up by 2 octaves, and so on and so on. Let me use trigger signals, regular trigger signals, which have only up flanks. Well, of course, they have also down flanks, but they are so short that only their up flanks cause an action in the circuit. I connect SoloRack and my DAW and use different trigger signals to make the VCO's octave going up, but not going down. At first the clock signal, which is sent only if my DAW's sequencer is running. And now the gate signal using the SD02 MIDI sync module. I return to the LFO and feed its output in the CV jack. And whereas the absolute level of the LFO's signal didn't matter with the trigger input, it, of course, matters with the CV input. Well, I insert an amplifier module between the LFO and the VCO to determine the range of frequency shift. The range of the tune knob is 12 semitones, 1 octave. Let's have a quick look at the 4 waveforms. Saw. Triangle. Sine. And pulse square. more waveforms are available simultaneously. Let me introduce a mixer and demonstrate that. Well, some more exquisite features of the S310 VCO now. Analog exponential frequency modulation. Wow, what a term. I'm not going to explain frequency modulation here, at least not in detail. There is a workshop about digital DX7-like frequency modulation. You'll find the link down in the description. Only one short demonstration today. If you increase the frequency of a tremolo, what is a kind of sub-audio frequency modulation, you get those typical analog FM sounds when the modulating frequency is in the audible range of more than, let's say, about 25 Hz. I use the S302 Sine VCO to demonstrate this. Have I woken you up? Oh, sorry. There are three main factors which determine the spectrum, the character of the sound. It is the strength of the modulation, which can be adjusted using the FM knob. Then it is the relation of the two frequencies, that of the VCO and that of the modulating oscillator. And, of course, the waveform. Changing the waveform of the modulated VCO called the carrier at first now. And now I use different waves as a modulator. I insert a second S310 VCO to do so. We have entered a whole realm of sounds, and it would take years, literally, and it took me, literally, years indeed, to investigate and to get familiar with this area of sound design. There are some principles and even rules, but this is not an FM tutorial, so I leave those researches up to you for today at least. But just one thing. Don't forget that we can modulate the strength of the modulation as well. We only have to use an amplifier to do so. All right, pulse width modulation, PWM. Well, most of you will have at least one synth which is able to change and modulate the pulse width, the duty cycle of its square wave. But with the S310 VCO we can do something similar with a triangle wave and even with the sine wave. just in case you didn't know, the term duty cycle refers to the percentage rate of the on or high phase in relation to the whole cycle of a periodic wave. It's easy with square and pulse waves, as the graph shows. Let me demonstrate how it is with a triangle wave. I attach the pulse wave to the right stereo channel and the triangle wave to the left one. The green line in the signal analyzer shows the pulse wave, and the blue line shows the triangle wave. And we see it's more or less the same. The only difference to the behavior of the pulse wave is that the terms on or high and off or low doesn't mean above the zero level and below the zero level, but up and down. Let's see how pulse width modulation works with a sine wave. I replace the triangle with a sine and watch what happens. It's kind of strange, isn't it? Okay, with a duty cycle of 50%, we get the original analog sine wave, but as we see, the beginning of the up phase is not at the same time as the square wave's jump to its high level. The sine wave starts its upwards part of the cycle later than the square wave does, and it's of course the same with the down phase. As long as we use only sine waves in a patch, this, let's say, delayed reaction doesn't have any influence. It simply doesn't matter. And it's the same when there is no danger of phase cancellations, better said, phase influences. But when phase relations play a role in our patch, we will have to remember this phase shift. Well, it's not really a phase shift, but more about that later. Between the phase shift between the sine wave on one hand and the triangle and the pulse wave on the other hand. The reason for these differences, these phase shifts, will not be explained here. It's too far beyond the framework of SoloRack tutorial, but I'm going to explain these things in my Grandpa Soundstone series on my other channel, Music, VSTs and more. You'll find the link to this series down in the description of this video. By the way, there is also a phase shift between the sine and the saw wave, and between the saw wave and the square wave, and this kind of shift will be explained in this video a little later, please. Well, but back to pulse width modulation. We see and hear that the amplitude decreases with duty cycles of more than 50% as well as with duty cycles of less than 50%. Sine waves and triangle waves behave identical in this aspect. reason is energy. I hear you saying, "Dear God, physics again." Yes, physics. But I'll make it easy and use only a simple example here. And again, if you want to go deeper into the matter here, then go and follow Grandpa Soundstone. If we have a pulse wave with a maximum representing 100 watt, for example, and a pulse width of 5 milliseconds, the pulse's energy is 0.5 joule. But if the pulse width is only 2 milliseconds, the pulse's energy decreases to 0.2 joule. Less energy means less volume here. And because sine waves and triangle waves don't have those everything or nothing jumps of a square wave, then they can change their amplitude to produce more or less volume. They can do this. Okay. All my former students of the wonderful matter of physics will probably be crying, "Oh, Professor Rolf has gone bananas." But I think I found a rough but quite useful explanation of the goings-on for all those who don't like physics and maths that much, but nevertheless don't want to lose their, let me say, feeling of how their synths are behaving under the hood. But even the square wave decreases its amplitude, its maximum level. Please watch the levels of the partials in the spectrum, the lower signal analyzer. Well. Let me return to Earth and to the functionality of the S310 GCO. We don't get a duty cycle of 0% or of 100%. Well, it wouldn't even make sense, because this would mean no sound at all, but a simple DC offset, direct current offset, direct voltage offset, better said, of plus or minus the maximum amplitude of the pulse wave. But when I increase oversampling, meaning increasing the internal sample rate of SoloRack, I get quite near to 0% and to 100%. Well, next functions, Hardsync and bend. Hardsync first. And again some basic explanations for the beginners before I dive into details. Hardsync means that one oscillator, called the master, forces a second oscillator, called the slave, to begin its cycle always when the first oscillator, the master, starts its cycle. In some cases, when it ends his cycle. The result is a sound richer of partials and often quite harsh. I want to spend some time looking at different frequency relations of both oscillators and then showing the behavior of different waveforms. First of all, when the master forces the slave to start a new cycle, to reset, it seems clear that the resulting frequency of the master-slave system is the frequency of the masters. It seems. The graph shows an example with the master's frequency twice the slave's frequency. We see also how the master forces the slave to begin a new cycle even before the slave has completed his cycle, or its cycle, which results in a lower peak-to-peak amplitude. But when the master's frequency is lower than the slave's and the relation of the frequencies is a relation of octaves, meaning the master's frequency is exactly half the slave's frequency or exactly a quarter of the slave's frequency and so on, then nothing happens. How is that? Well, the Hardsync impulses from the master reach the slave always then when the slave is going to start a new cycle anyway. Therefore, the resulting overall frequency is that of the slaves in situations like this one. But the real fun begins when master and slave are detuned against each other by other differences than octaves or integer numbers of octaves. First of all, with frequency relations where the slave's frequency is not an integer multiple of the master's frequency, our rules that the master's frequency is the resulting overall frequency is valid again, even with the master's frequency being lower than the slave's one. And, of course, our frequency rule is valid with non-integer relations, with the master's frequency being the higher one. I can't help playing around a bit. I modulate the master's frequency with an LFO and regulate the strength, the amplitude of the LFO's signal with an amplifier. Replace the LFO with a sine sub-oscillator to get higher modulating frequencies. modulate the slave's frequency. Again, back to Earth. Let me show different waveforms and Hardsync now. There shouldn't be any further explanations necessary anymore, and anyway, feel free to ask me. It is remarkable that even signals which are not sharp-edged cause synchronization with the SoloRack. There are synths which don't synchronize with master's waves, being, for example, a sine wave. I encourage you to try sending the master's signal through an effect chain before you feed it in the slave's sync jack. There are some interesting sounds to gain this way. Please do some experiments of your own. There is a switch below the sync jack. We can change the method of synchronization from Hardsync to a method called bend. Bend is developed by Solo Stuff, the maker of SoloRack, and of course they don't tell us what exactly they did, how exactly they implemented this method. All in all, bend leads to a bit less powerful sounds, often softer and easier to handle in a mix. Still typical sync sounds, but not as outstanding and mainly not as harsh as sounds gained by hardsyncing. I'll talk about the bend mode in some minutes again. Well, the half-wave rectifier at first, called RA. This function is only applied to the sine wave and cuts off the lower half of the sine wave. The result is a sound which is a bit richer, fuller than the sine wave, the pure sine wave. The pure analog sine wave, of course. Please listen and watch the oscilloscope and the spectrum. As there is a CV input jack, we can modulate the amount of this rectifying, for example by an LFO or by an ADSR. But there is a second function of this rectifier. When the sync mode band is chosen, we can change the shape and the sound then, of course, of the synchronization. Of course, only with a sine wave. This patch shouts for some modulation, don't you think? The S310 VCO has got two cores, two internal oscillators, a saw oscillator and a square oscillator, which delivers also the source, also the source for the sine and the triangle wave. And now something important concerning phase and phase shift. Do you remember some minutes ago? Oscillators and oscillator cores are switched off to save CPU resources when they are not used, meaning when their outputs are not connected to anything. But this implicates that their phases are not synchronized. Every time I connect a core anew, its phase will be different. Please watch the saw wave jumping around every time I disconnect and reconnect the saw core. If I want them to be always in the same phase relation, I must connect both cores to something, to anything, and then send a trigger impulse or a clock impulse to the sync inject. But when I disconnect one of the cores and reconnect it later, the mess starts anew. Well, it isn't really a mess. It is like with real hardware modules, and phase shifts lead to richer sounds. But what if I wanted the cores being in phase, even if I am not using the wave from one of them right now, but will use it later and don't want, for some reason, to synchronize it again, to synchronize it then later. For example, in a live situation on stage. Well, fortunately, being used doesn't mean being audible. If I want to synchronize the cores for later use, I just connect the core which I'm not using right now to anything and leave it connected. I must not, of course, disconnect it from this anything later. I usually use a mixer unit for that reason. Everything I have said about phase in the last minutes is also valid for different units, not only for the two cores of a single unit. Let me demonstrate the phase shifts and my synchronization technique with two independent VCO units. Well, time for some patching. Today I'm not going to explain our patch broad and wide. I'll show you some pictures of it instead, while SoloRack is playing the patch. Enjoy it. Let me say goodbye. Let it be enough for today. In my next tutorial about SoloRack, I'm going to talk about the other oscillator units in detail. And then there will be a quite complex patch using all the oscillators and more units. So, thank you for watching today. There is a website of mine at www.rowfilm-media.net where you will find more information about this series of tutorials, and you will also find an overview about all things I'm currently working on, including all 4 of my YouTube channels. And there is a forum there, the Deep Sound Divers Coffee House, where you can discuss my videos. And, my friends, I work only part-time to be able to produce videos like this one, and I depend on donations to do so. That's a fact. If also you want to support my work, please click on the link in the comments to this video down and donate a bit. Thank you very much. And now, have a great day and a good time. Enjoy your life. Rolf.